Thanks for being here. My name is Stephanie Borat. I'm the Director of Donor Relations for the Coastal Land Trust. Just a reminder, as we usually do at the beginning of the Little Lunch Lectures, we are recording. We are live on Facebook, as I just mentioned. If you don't want to have your image online, feel free to turn your video off. But if you don't care about that, we'd love to continue to see your faces during the presentation. There will be a couple of links in the chat if you are interested in being on our email list or sending a donation our way. If you just love this program and love what it's all about, because it's all about land conservation and our strategy for moving forward, it'll make it easy for you to just click that link. And we will keep everybody on mute during the talk, but if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and I can read it out loud at the end when we have Q&A, or at the end if you want to unmute yourself and ask Camilla a question, that would be just fine at that time. So let me introduce our speaker today. We are super glad that Camilla Herlevich is our presenter today. Camilla is one of the founders and for the next 10 weeks, the executive director of the Coastal Land Trust. Having started her career in conservation as an attorney for another conservation group that shall remain nameless, she founded the Coastal Land Trust, and it's one of the most successful land conservation groups in the state of North Carolina and maybe the United States, but we're, maybe a little biased. Now, with more than 80,000 acres saved in the coastal plain, the Coastal Land Trust has its sights set on the best and the most imperiled lands along our coast. And Camilla is here today to talk with us about how those decisions are made and what kinds of projects are coming next. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you, Stephanie, and it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first actual presentation for the Little Lunch Lectures since we've been moving to this virtual format. So it's nice to be here, and I'm so glad to have people like Laura and Stephanie helping out on the technical end. I've titled my presentation the Top 40 Coastal Conservation Projects. And the cool thing, or at least I hope you'll find that it's cool, is we're going to give you a little peek behind the curtain today so that you can see how we make our decisions, how Janice Allen, our Director of Land Protection, assisted by Lee Leidy, our attorney and Northeast Director, and the rest of the staff come to agreement about where to spend the resources of the Coastal Land Trust and which properties to target when we make our decisions. As you probably know, the North Carolina Coastal Land Trust region is the largest of any land trust in the state. We were established in 1992 at a time when land trusts were being created all over the United States. But the North Carolina Coastal Land Trust is in many ways unique. It covers a third of the coastal plain, a third of the state, the entire coastal plain, 31 counties. And as those of you who live here or were born here or vacation here know, it's a place of incredible natural resources. We have barrier island beaches, we have blackwater and brownwater rivers, we have rare plants like carnivorous plants, we have beautiful forests of longleaf pine that used to cover 93 million acres of the coastal plain were very, very present and iconic landscape here. And we have swamp forest, and we have precosins, and we have historic resources. So where did we start is a really good first question to ask. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with a little bit of technical information. For those of you who might be botanists, you'll probably really jazz on this, and then we'll talk about how that translates into coming up with a list of projects, and we'll see some pictures and hear about things. But basically for us, the key challenge is how to protect the best places, given the fact that we are a relatively small organization. We're not the state of North Carolina, we're not Wildlife Resources Commission, we're not the Nature Conservancy. So the key for us is in a place of incredible richness in terms of natural resources, but in a place that does not have commensurate economic or financial resources in terms of philanthropic giving, although we're working to raise that up. How do we figure out what we should be protecting? So basically, for many years, one of the key phrases that we use, and this is developed by Janice Allen, as a matter of fact, the entire PowerPoint was developed by Janice Allen, our Director of Land Acquisition, but from a board presentation that she made several years ago. But our conservation strategy is something that we refer to as our ABC conservation strategy. We assist others, including local and state agencies, with land conservation projects, nature preserves, game lands, trails, state parks that provide for outdoor recreation and the conservation of natural areas. One reason that land trusts can do that is that we are more nimble, perhaps, than some state agencies can be. We can act more quickly. And so a lot of our work is to be a good partner to organizations that do have more resources, both for land acquisition in terms of capital and for land management in terms of staff to rangers, if you will, or biologists to manage land, to buffer existing conservation lands and to connect existing conservation lands. Those of you who are biologists know that in the field of wildlife biology, bigger is better. Protecting 100 acres near to an existing refuge provides more habitat for larger animals than 100 acres standing alone. So the way that we think about it is buy big or say very special standalone places. From almost the beginning of our founding, and this is due in part to my training, working for 10 years for, as Stephanie said, the organization that shall not be named, I'm going to go ahead and name it, was the Nature Conservancy. And also the fact that one of our co-founders, Chuck Rowe, the other two co-founders are Bill Rainey and Michael Murkison, had been associated with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. We've always had a criteria of which projects we wanted to protect and which ones we didn't. And generally, they identified particular river areas, particular landscape types. And so we targeted places along the lower Cape Fear or in the Neuse River. So we've always had some criteria. And to develop this criteria, we had always used the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program inventories, and we had consulted with other agencies like Wildlife Resources to come up with a protection criteria. So even from the beginning, we were targeted. We didn't just take anything that fell in our lap. Someone calls and offers a gift of marshland. And we knew that there were some opportunity. We did take opportunities, and we were opportunistic to some extent when someone wanted to give us something. And we looked at it and it did have good ecological criteria and values, we'd take it. But we've always tried to be more systematic about it. In 2015, we had a board strategic planning retreat, and one of our board members there challenged us to say, why don't we figure out what the most important conservation projects are in the entire coastal plain and see if we can protect them? We had never done that. We hadn't really taken a comprehensive look. Well, those of you who know Janice and Lee and Jessica on our land team know that if there is a group of individuals who are up to a conservation challenge, it is the three of them. And so Janice really was the architect of the response to this challenge. So what she did was to begin to come up with what we originally thought was going to be a top 20 list of projects. And she started with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. So for those of you who are not familiar with that, there is a state program that has been around, gosh, for 30 or 40 years in North Carolina state government, and it's mirrored by similar programs with other states. And it's a database that is composed of biological reports from field inventories. It's composed of, in the old days, there were maps and colored overlays. Now it's composed of GIS layers. It basically is a database that looks over all of the important species and ecosystems in the state of North Carolina and identifies the places that are important, most critical from a diversity, from a biological, from an ecological standpoint. That is important not just to conservationists, but it's important to planners and developers because it shows us what things should be avoided for development as well as what things should be saved. So that was really one of the key resources that Janice used in developing her top list of conservation projects. She did look, though, at Wildlife Resources studies that they use for their top priorities. She looked at the Division of Coastal Management, wetlands criteria and wetlands that they had valued. And she looked at, what else? She looked at other groups. So what the goal was to come up with a working list, a database, not static, not exhaustive, and geo-referenced with information about parcels to come up with what the most important coastal plain projects are that we could begin working on. And early on, she made a really interesting assumption, and that is that we wouldn't necessarily be the organization that would be handling all of these projects. We might collaborate with them. So it is a database or a list, if you will, that is primarily for our guidance, but it also contemplates that we might be collaborating or partnering with others as well. And so this was what came out of our strategic plan. So what Janice decided to do was that rather than coming up with a list that was based of descriptors, these are among the projects that we want to do, to actually look at potential sites and develop a ranking system with numeric values. And so that we could come up with a criteria and actually rank the list instead of just having sort of a humongous list of things that we thought were important. And so she took a look she came up with 10 particular criteria, assigned 100 points and distributed those points among the criteria. And we'll go through each of those. So I told you there's going to be a little geekiness here. So the 10 criteria are ecological significance, that comes from the Heritage Program data, biodiversity or wildlife habitat assessment, again from the Heritage Program, but a little bit of a larger filter, if you will. Landscape position of the tract relative to others, other conservation values that may not be ecological, and we'll have some fun with some of this. The size of the property, remember, bigger is better. Climate change resiliency, certainly something that we here at the coast need to be thinking about. Whether or not there's a willing seller, and we'll talk about why that's important. Whether there is the possibility for future public use or access, the funding feasibility, and the threat. So we're going to go through these criteria. So the first one that we started with was ecological significance. What does that mean? What is a special natural area? The North Carolina Natural Heritage Program has identified more than 2,500 natural areas across our state. A natural area is a site, it can be terrestrial or aquatic, of special biodiversity significance due to the presence of rare species, unique natural communities, important animal assemblages, or other ecological features. So for example, a rare plant could be something like a carnivorous plant. A natural community could be a longleaf pine forest. So one particular site might have values both as a natural community and it might have rare species. So that particular criteria gets a lot of points in our system. So the sites were ranked by Janice, at the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. They're ranked based on the occurrence of these rare plant and animal species and special habitats. And the methodology of the Natural Heritage Program is to include both a fine filter of species and natural communities, the larger filter, both as elements of biodiversity. And the ranking of sites that the Natural Heritage Program uses is not numeric, but they have a ranking based on exceptional, very high, high, and moderate descriptors. So Janice basically put a number value on the descriptors that the Natural Heritage Program gave them. And as you'll see, she gave a very high number of points, 15 points, to this particular criteria. The second criteria is the biodiversity and wildlife habitat. And again, the primary model used or source here is the Natural Heritage Program, but they also assess these natural areas in terms of their functionality and connectivity. So again, this is a little bit even of a larger filter, if you will, and how something adds to the total view in the state of North Carolina or within the Eastern Seaboard itself. So in addition to the Natural Heritage Program, other data sets that look at the natural resources of our state were consulted. The National Audubon Society's inventory of important bird areas, which is similar to what we've done, but it's focused on bird habitat. The National Wetlands Inventory, Species Guild, our own state Division of Water Quality's ranking of outstanding resource waters and high quality waters are some of our terrestrial systems adjacent to outstanding resource waters or high quality waters. That would add to it. And again, we distributed 15 points of our total score of 100 to this criteria. You might expect, for example, an area where it was an important migration corridor for black bear, for example, to rank higher under this. So this also looks at wildlife habitat in particular. The third criteria is landscape position. Remember, bigger is better. So if a property connects to or is adjacent to existing conservation lands, we gave them a maximum of 10 points for this criteria. If it's along a priority river or a existing conservation corridor, 5 points. If it's along a tributary, 3 points. And if it's within a mile but not exactly adjacent, we gave it a value of 1 point. Other conservation value. Obviously, there are some places that are important for reasons other than just conservation. Military values. And so you're saying, what in the world do military values have to do with the Coastal Land Trust criteria to come up with the top conservation projects at the coast? Well, the reason for that is that we are also very pragmatic here at the Coastal Land Trust, and we would like to save some of these properties. And the way that we're going to be able to save them, by and large, is to buy them. And the Department of Defense has for many years had a program in which it works cooperatively, with land trusts and land conservation programs. And what they have discovered is that many of the lands that are surrounding their existing bases or beneath their pilots' training routes or within a noise buffer have value to them as being undeveloped. They want to preserve these buffers of undeveloped land because if they are developed, then they're more likely to get complaints, and there actually are military bases in Virginia and California that have had to shut down because encroaching development made it so that the mission of this particular military installation can no longer be met. So the military developed a program in which they will bring 50% of the purchase price or the fair market value of a conservation area to the table if there are projects that meet their strategic military purposes to buffer their facilities, and if they also have conservation values. So, and as you'll see when we start talking about the projects the Land Trust has been successful in protecting recently, the military is one of our most important partners. So military values are a big plus for us. It means that the project might actually get funded. Historic values also, it's not surprising that you would see historic landscapes and historic buildings coexisting with conservation areas, but this is something that many of our supporters find to be important as well as conservation values, and so do we. High quality waters, preserving surface water and water quality integrity and drinking water supplies is important for us, and working farms and forests is an important additive. So even if the project, for example, is being harvested for timber, it may not be a legacy forest that would, it wouldn't be an ecologically important forest perhaps for longleaf pine, but we also value here in North Carolina the fact that land stay in working farms and forests as opposed to being turned into concrete and development. Again, the size of the property is important. The larger the property, the more it takes on, let me put it differently. It takes almost as much energy to protect a project that is 30 acres sometimes as it does to protect a project that is 1,000 acres. So if we're talking about an organization with limited resources, we want to get the most bang for our buck. So it's not just conservation, but we'd like to spread our money around and our energy around and protect as much land as we can. So a decreasing score in terms of the larger it is, the higher the score, the smaller it is, the lower the score. Climate change resiliency. It shouldn't surprise anyone that both today and going forward, the Coastal Land Trust needs to take into consideration the effect of climate change resiliency on our conservation properties. And so there are many sophisticated ways of measuring climate resiliency This is obviously a shorthand version, but I think an effective one. We've just given 5 points to as the highest score if there's high resiliency, which we've defined as property is inland and not on a waterway, with decreasing scores as you get closer and closer to the coast or adjacent to the coast. The 7th category is there a willing seller? So you might think, well, what does that have to do with a purely scientific scoring system? Well, it's not purely scientific. We like to get things done. We are a can-do organization. We're not an academic organization. We want to save land. So if, and it's not to say that we know what the inclination of every landowner in the state is, we don't. But if we know something about the land, landowner's inclination, having a willing seller certainly moves it up in terms of the proper projects that we want to work on in our criteria. So if the owner is known to us and is willing, we think, to sell at fair market value, that jumps the score up. At the other end, if there's a knowing, willing seller and wants more than fair market value, not so much. And there's always plenty of people in this basket too. So we're trying to, again, be the most efficient we can with your donor dollars for our staff and get the best possible results for the time that we're out there negotiating for land. The 8th criteria is future public use and access. As a nonprofit organization that has a public mission of protecting land and serving public purposes, we certainly are cognizant of the fact that the more that we can provide access to the public, the more support there is for land conservation, and the more that our mission is relevant to people. So if there is a possibility that our property can be placed into public ownership, that obviously is something that we want to do, because we know that we're protecting not just the critters, the birds and the bees, but that we're also providing recreational resources for people and for communities. If we will keep it with our much smaller staff than, say, a county park or a state agency, we don't have an awful lot of opportunity to have public access, but occasionally we do, like at Springer's Point, there's 5 points. And then also if property would be privately owned, but the owner might be amenable to occasional tours or field trips, we give them 1 point. And it's possible that we do sometimes protect properties where there isn't any public access, but obviously it's less likely to rise to the top of our list if that is the case. And again, you could see that I was thinking about this with some of the other criteria, the funding feasibility, and I'm not going to recite here, but the funding feasibility is actually comprised of 2 factors. How costly is it as opposed to how cheap, and how likely is it to qualify for a grant. So clearly the more expensive that a property is, well, excuse me, let me take that back. The less expensive that it is, and the more likely it is that there is a source of funding out there, the more points it's going to get. The more expensive it is, and the less likely it is that it's going to qualify for a grant, then the lower the points are. And I'll just say there are a lot of projects that we would like to do and that the owner would like for us to do, but we just simply cannot put the money together. And that has become even more of a factor lately as state funding resources have declined. I can tell you of the old days, back in the day, when there was $100 million for the state of North Carolina and what was then the North Carolina Clean Water Management Trust Fund, now newly christened as the North Carolina Land and Water Trust Fund, the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, Walter, I'm sorry, I didn't get it exactly right. They do a great job, but they have much, much less money these days than they did, say, 10 years ago. So until the General Assembly sees fit to increase that, we really are limited in the projects that we can undertake by the money in that fund and by other, because you donors are important, but most of the money that you give us is used for paying the rent, keeping the office open. These big capital grants from primarily government agencies, but also some foundations and some donors are the ones that really allow us to purchase significant conservation land. So feasibility is a big one. And then we also actually do look at the threat of development. So if we're pretty confident that there is not likely to be a big threat, something is less, we're going to rank it as less of a priority, less of an urgent priority than something that we know we really need to, we may have one opportunity, we may have one window to purchase this property. That would move something up in our criteria. So I hope I haven't bored you with the technical details, but that is sort of what we look at. So now, oops, I'm running out of time. So Northeast and Outer Banks region, these are the top 40 sites in our region. We have 3 sites along the Scuppernong River, 2 along Indiantown Creek, 2 along Ocracoke Island. 1 site is saved, the second one is under contract. This is my happy place. The Chowan River, one of the top 40 sites saved, 950 acres. And Salmon Creek, I'm delighted, if you've been with us for a long time, you know that we actually borrowed money 3 years ago to save 1,000 acres, and working in partnership with state parks, we were able to save 1,000 acres 3 years ago, and we've added 300 acres this year. And it is the first state park or natural area in the Bertie or Chowan County area. And so this is a list of our top 40 sites in the Northeast. And you will see that we have these big red eyes. We don't want anyone to think we're coming after them. So it's a very, very big red bullseye. And you'll see all those happy check marks of places that have been saved already. So we're very happy about that. In the Mid-Coast region, we have saved 2 tracts adjacent to Croatown National Forest from the top 40 site. One beautiful site that's actually in Carteret County, not Beaufort County, which is pictured there, Salters Creek, more than 5,000 acres. It's a combination military site and conservation site. And 2 sites saved, one at Gales Creek and one at Duck Creek. There's another there saved in the Mid-Coast region. So we've been very successful there. And here, the military partnership here is with the U.S. Marine Corps at Cherry Point. And that was one of the reasons we were able to protect such an extraordinarily large tract of land down at Salters Creek. And here's our map of the top 40 projects saved along the Mid-Coast region. As you can see, a lot of wonderful blue check marks there as well. In the Southeast region, we have not been as successful. And, you know, it's worth noting that we do not have a military partner here in the Southeast region like we do in the Mid-Coast region and the Northeast. And I should also say, this is my home region. Before we had our top 40 list, this was an area where we'd had extraordinary conservation success on the west banks of the Cape Fear River, with more than 19,000 acres protected, including the County Nature Park, Orton Plantation, Old Town, lots of beautiful lands on the west bank of the Cape Fear River. But since the top 40 list was developed, we have also saved a couple of important sites, one beautiful 3,000 acre tract along the Waccamaw River. And we have just this month gotten a great tract under contract along the lower Cape Fear, 1,000 acres. We haven't done anything quite like that in the lower Cape Fear in quite a while. So that makes me a very happy lady. And here is our top 40 map for the Southeast region. Hopefully we will be adding another check to that soon. So why do we bother? Well, I hope that you're here because you understand it. But even despite the pause that there has been in the real estate recession and then COVID, there is still an urgent need to protect land at the coast. Our population is estimated to increase by 50% to $12 million by 2030. Our state, this is always hard for me to believe, we lead the nation in lost farm and forest land, more than 1 million acres in 10 years. And the pattern of modern development is fragmenting that longleaf pine area that used to cover it, the migration corridors for wildlife, and it is affecting essentially the fabric of our natural resources here. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the Coastal Land Trust. And as you noticed, we have a top 40 list, but we don't have 40 projects saved. So we've made great progress. In response to the top 40 list in 2015, we also launched in response a campaign to raise more money to save more land. And we have a very ambitious $36 million campaign goal. You may think, my goodness, that's awfully crazy for a small land trust like the Coastal Land Trust to take on. And you're right, it was. But here's the extraordinary thing. We're going to finish it. We are going to finish it. I have no doubt about that. We have more than 31 million completed already. Our goals are, the bulk of it, as you would expect from a land conservation group, are to save land. But we also have goals of $3 million so that we can act quickly this $3 million would be basically our walking around money when Janice has a project that she wants to purchase. Instead of having to borrow money for it, she's going to lose it if it's on the market. We would have our own money, like the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Fund have had for decades. So we have $2 million in that fund. We'd love to have another $1.4 million. And the Promise Fund is to make sure that when we have all of these lands protected, the top 40 or the others that before the top 40 list was created, 80,000 acres in all, we have the ability to protect them in the future. So our goal was to add $2 million to our stewardship endowment and to build capacity. So it's amazing to me, and it's thanks to many of you who are on this call, that we have been as successful as we have been with the Our Land campaign. So I hurried it up, and I'm afraid I geeked out too much at the start and didn't spend as much time on the beautiful places as I wanted to, but I'm sort of a geek at heart. So I guess my closing comment, and I'll take questions if y'all want, is the Coastal Land Trust, I'll be retiring, but there are fabulous professionals that are working on the Coastal Land Trust. The top 40 is not completed. There's work yet to be done, and we welcome your participation. So if Stephanie, if you'd like for me to end the screen share, I will stop that right there. And I'm sorry I went over, guys.
Camilla, you're fine on time. We wanted to hear this information, and honestly, even being on staff for 7 years, it's awesome to have a refresher in this type of format. So thank you. I'm glad I was here today. I will encourage anyone who has a question to unmute and ask it, or type it into the chat, and we'll give you a few minutes to do that. Sometimes it takes a minute to find an unmute. Who has a question? Hey, Jeff.
Hey, first of all, I want to thank you for finally convincing Camilla to come on here. I think a lot of us have been waiting for this day. So thank you to both of you. Camilla, I have a quick question for you. I've known you a long time, and it seems like the Land Trust has shifted away from doing conservation easements and more towards acquisition over the last years. What's been the driver of that?
That's a great question, Jeff. The North Carolina, the primary driver is that the General Assembly abolished the North Carolina Conservation Tax Credit in 2015. And so until then, there was a lot of, you're right, most of our work were donated conservation easements from very generous landowners who wanted to pass their land down intact to their family, wanted to make sure that they could perhaps capture some of that value with tax benefits, and what a reasonable thing to do. So for many years, you'll never make money on donating a conservation easement. You're always giving up value, but the value that you gave up and your future revenue that you gave up was offset by the fact that you could claim not just a federal tax deduction at 30% or whatever of the value of the land, but in North Carolina, it was a conservation tax credit. And that's like more money in your pocket. So you could actually, it was just much more financially, there was a much better financial incentive to private landowners in 2015. That was at the same time that tax rates were reduced and the credits were flattened. The historic tax credit was also abolished here in North Carolina at that time. The historic tax credit is coming back again. Perhaps in the future that will come back. I would expect that if it does, that conservation easements and donations of projects would come back also.
Camilla, there was a question in the chat about from that slide where you were describing the cost of the property. It seemed like 3 million or under was kind of a sweet spot, because that 3 to 6 million had lower points. And so I think the question is, like, why is that $3 million the sweet spot, as opposed to, like, what's the consequence of it being a much more expensive project if you have the funding?
Right. Well, the answer is if you had the funding, because the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, which is a primary source of funding for us, actually has a cap of the last few years has had a cap of $1.2 million for all of its grants. So it may have $20 million spread around the state, or $25 million to spread around the state, but one can apply for no more than, well, you can apply for what you want, but you're not going to get more than $1.2 million per project from the Clean Water Management Trust Fund. And many of our federal grants require a 50-50 match. So many of the federal grants that Janice applies for have a maximum of $1 million. So, you know, typically when we go in for a project, we package the grants, but you just run out of money. If you have $1 million from the state and $1 million from the federal, you might be able to raise another $500,000 or $1 million from private sources or from a foundation. But good observation, Ryan. We clearly have some mathematicians out there.
There's a comment from Winya Rivers saying, thank you so much for the for all that we're doing to protect the North Carolina portion, especially of the Waccamaw River, which flows down to Winya Rivers region, and the other lands in the Cape Fear Arch. That's
great. Is that Christine Ellis or someone else from Winya?
I'm not quite sure. They're logged in as Winya, so.
Okay. Well, thank you. They're a great partner. We love what you do. Hey,
it's me. It's me. I came in late, so I was embarrassed by that. But
it's all right.
Yes, thank you.
You do great work in South Carolina and everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We love the partnership for sure. Thank you.
Awesome. And Chris Pigler's given us a shout out, as is Angie Carl. So thank you guys so much for your positive feedback in the chat. Happy to take any other questions if there are any at the moment. And if not, we will cut you guys loose for your weekend. Camilla, thank you so much. Oh, there's another one just popped in. How do we learn and hear about new projects coming up?
Well, we have our list, and so that's one way. But Janice answers the phone call. I mean, you'd be surprised the phone calls that you get, especially around the end of the year. And we also are approached by our partners. Janice participates. There are a couple of conservation planning collaboratives. There's the Onslow Bight Conservation Collaborative, in which various resource agencies, including the Coastal Land Trust, the Coastal Federation, the Nature Conservancy, the Marine Corps, all get together and they look at, together what things are important, what opportunities are coming up. There is a similar collaborative that we initiated called the Cape Fear Arch that actually looks at projects in southeastern North Carolina and northeastern South Carolina. And so, there's always a buzz, but, sometimes landowners will call us. And sometimes, a property owner will call us and say there's a for sale sign. That doesn't usually happen to turn into something that we can help for, because obviously the landowner at that point has not decided on a conservation option. But from all sorts of different places, but primarily from our partners and from being active in the conservation community and just sort of being friends. It was so much easier when we shared offices with the Nature Conservancy and the Coastal Federation and Audubon Society, which we did for years until we had our new digs. But that was really a wonderful opportunity. I'd love it if there was a conservation central for all of us to work out at the same place.
Life goals moving forward. So a couple other shout outs coming from Walter Clark, good friend, and to say thank you, Camille, especially for all that you do and continue to do for conservation.
Walter is the head of the North Carolina Land and Water Fund, guys. And I see we have our new board member, Nick Parker, there. Thank you, Nick, and Angie Carl from the Nature Conservancy.
And
Nancy Guthrie.
And
Nancy Guthrie from Clean, I can't get it straight, the Land and Water Fund. Thank you, Nancy, too.
They just changed their name this week, so it's okay. So good. Well, let me tell you guys a little bit about the upcoming talks for the Little Lunch Lectures. Let me scroll down, because October 30th John Carpenter from the Wildlife Resources Commission will be with us to talk about the red cockaded woodpecker. It is currently listed as endangered, and so we will hear about the habitats that they like to live in and why. Well, I'll let him talk about it next week, but join us to learn about that special bird. I think actually, John, hello, hi, you're on the talk this week, so thanks for joining us. Then on November the 6th, Sam Cook, who is a board member of the Coastal Land Trust and is on staff at the College of Natural Resources at NC State, will talk about their forest assets team and their practice of sustainable forest management. They have 10 forests that they utilize as sites, especially for students, and one in particular is called Hoffman Forest, and so he's going to talk a little bit about that. So please make plans to join us the next couple of Fridays. We're moving on for the foreseeable with our Little Lunch lectures, so if you want to know what else is coming up in November and December, head over to coastallandtrust.org/events for that list, and that's updating constantly, so I kind of can't even keep up sometimes. So keep that on your radar screen. Hope everyone has a fabulous weekend. Thank you for all the positive shout outs. Thank you, Camilla, for being here. And we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yep, thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you, Christine.
Bye.